Today, I am talking to Pulitzer Prize-winning author Caroline Fraser about her latest book, Murderland, which explores the possible role lead played in the rise of the serial killers of the 60s, 70s, and 80s. Welcome to the podcast, Caroline.
Thanks so much.
Thank you so much for coming on the show. You know, to be honest, when I first heard the premise of the book, I was like, oh no, everyone's going to think my kid is a serial killer. But then once I started reading the book, I was blown away by your meticulous research and how you supported your hypothesis. If Murderland was a research paper, your p-value would indicate strong evidence against the null hypothesis, like you make your case. I also appreciate how I think you make the case for prevention and also intervention, which as a mother of a lead affected kid, I really appreciate as well. Obviously, lead has dominated my life for the last 18 years. And I've really focused on making sure this doesn't happen to other kids. But I'm so curious how someone like you who didn't have that in their life made not only those connections, but how did you ever come up with lead might be the source behind the serial killers?
My initial introduction to all of this material was because I grew up in the Northwest in the 60s and 70s. And that was a time when the crime rate was really going up. And we began to see this phenomenon that is now called serial killers. But at the time, nobody really knew what it was. And so because I grew up there at that time, I was aware of this question that had just been kind of being kicked down the road decade after decade, which was why was there so much crime in that period? Why were there so many serial killers in the Pacific Northwest? Nobody could figure that out. And that was something that I thought a lot about because it just seemed like such a strange phenomenon. Crime went up nationally, internationally, and thinking about this whole thing about serial killers, I started to wonder, well, could there be anything that would explain this rise? Is there anything to explain it in the Northwest? And so I started looking for research that would maybe have something to say about this, and quickly came upon this whole theory about lead and crime.
And you're speaking of the Nevin study, is that right?
There's more. I mean, there was a guy named Rick Nevins who sort of aggregated a number of studies and pointed to a lot of historical evidence for this in various places. So I began to think about, well, maybe you could look at what were the sources of lead in the Northwest. I knew that Ted Bundy had come from Tacoma, the city south of Seattle. I knew that Gary Ridgway, the Green River Killer, also grew up near Tacoma, which I thought was weird. But then I found out that Charles Manson also spent some significant time in that area. And so I started looking at Tacoma and quickly, of course, discovered that it was a hotbed of lead pollution.
Yeah.
So that
Uh,
to me was a really sort of fascinating series of things that could maybe be part of a story that could be told.
Your investigation led you to these smelters. Do you mind just explaining to people what a smelter is and
Sure.
how it could possibly pollute an entire area?
We now no longer have hardly any smelters left in this country, but for about a century, from the late 1800s and well into the 1970s and 80s, there were smelters all over the place. And a smelter is essentially an industrial facility that is producing metal. They're burning rocks or ores that are mined, and these rocks are full of all different kinds of metals, including lead. The particular smelter that I was looking at in Tacoma was owned by a company named ASARCO, the American Smelting and Refining Company, which was owned by the Guggenheim family of Guggenheim Museum fame. They for many, many decades made millions and millions of dollars from smelters all over the West, all over the country, and also in other parts of the world. The problem with smelters is that if you think about the early days of gold mining and how people are just kind of taking rocks and melting them. This is what they were doing in Tacoma. They were melting giant vats of metals that contained lead and copper and zinc, and they have giant smokestacks, and all this particulate stuff is coming out into the air. Another substance that was coming out into the atmosphere was arsenic. And the role of arsenic in the story, I think, is really quite interesting because everybody knows that arsenic is a poison. And in
Yeah.
fact, everybody has known that lead is a poison, not just for centuries,
Yeah.
but going back to the Romans. So it is
Mhm.
really hard now to believe any corporation or government entity that is trying to say that these things are not really that big of a deal. I mean, they're poisons.
Yeah, you should have been in New York City to one of our testimonies at the city council, and that's what the lawyers for the landlords and the real estate agencies tried to do after Cooper and I went up and testified to the horrors of what happens with lead. You know, they're like trying to say it's not as bad as they're making it out to seem, but you're absolutely right. In your book, so much of what you talk about is stuff that Cooper and I go up against all the time. They're still doing it. And in Arizona, there's a smelting plant right now. The New York Times did an article back in December where all they had to do was write a letter to the current administration's EPA and request to have the levels of particulates that are expelled from the smokestacks to be lowered. So they can now put more out and pollute the community. And the sad thing about lead is that people don't really understand just how dangerous it is. I think your book is so important because it's happening again and it's still happening.
Yeah.
And so I think your perspective on this idea that, well, you know, it's not happening to me or my family, so it's somebody else's problem. I do also think that there's compassion fatigue going on. I'm also a nurse,
Yeah.
so I can see compassion fatigue. There's so many battles, so many things to be fighting for, that I do see that people kind of like, oh, I can't fight that fight too. But lead will affect everyone. You talked about a school too. There was a smelter outside of a school. I would just appreciate it if you would tell the audience about what you unearthed with that as well. Because it's, again, it's what, you know, even just happened in our case where you have companies saying, like, should we take our chances getting sued or do we abate and do it correctly?
I mean, I'm sure that the school that I'm talking about was just one example of this, but the smelter that was in Tacoma, that company, Asarco, had long been doing business with another company in Idaho called Bunker Hill. And for years and years and years, there were serious silver mines all up in the hills above that town, and they had constructed a whole smelting facility there. And there was a a workers town neighborhood called Deadwood Gulch that was right where the smelter was. So families were living there, you know, the families of the guys who worked in these plants, and they had built an elementary school right across the street from the smokestack. And in the early 70s, they had a fire at this facility that destroyed the filtration plant. It destroyed a lot of the filters that were supposed to be removing lead from going up the smokestack. So then they were faced with this decision. Do we keep operating? And this was at a time when lead was selling quite high. It was making a lot of money for the corporate owner, which was Gulf plus Western at that time. Or do we shut down? Do we shut down and lose all this money? The lawyers who ultimately ended up suing because of this found a napkin that one of the corporate managers at Bunker Hill had written down the value of a child's life in Kellogg, what it would mean financially if they ended up having to pay for the maiming, the sickness, the destroyed lives, the lost lives of the children of this town, versus what they could make. And they decided, yeah, it's really not a question. We should just remain open and pollute the entire town, which they did. And they got caught because it was 1973, 74, and people were starting to pay attention to this stuff. Idaho found that all these kids were massively contaminated with lead, and many of them suffered. I think there were kids who died. It's
Yeah.
hard to prove that now because records were not kept the way they should have been, but I think there were doubtless kids who died. There were other children who really suffered for the rest and are suffering because some of them are still
Yeah.
alive for the rest of their lives. They were treated for lead contamination, but there's only so much that can be done.
Lead can stay in the long bones for decades, sometimes your entire life, and throughout different periods in your life, whether it's pregnancy, lactation, puberty. As you get older and your hormones change, your body will release it because it thinks it's releasing calcium into the bloodstream. And you can almost get re-exposed by your own body. And I just remember in the book you talking about the way that Ted Bundy would talk, especially when he was in prison. It almost seemed as if he was re-exposed, almost as if he had a psychotic break at one point.
In the case of Bundy, who I think we know had massive exposure to lead because we know how much lead was in his front yard and his backyard, thanks to the mapping that has been done in Tacoma. It's always hard when talking about his behavior to know what was actually going on with him because he lied about everything. To me, the lying part of the serial killer's behavior correlated so strongly with the lying of the corporate actors in all of this that I just thought that that really showed the kind of parallel between these crazy men who are running around the countryside terrorizing communities and these corporate people who are, the end justifies the means for them. I just felt that that was a big part of what could come out of this book, juxtaposing really the behavior of the serial killers and what was happening in the corporate world.
And in New York City, there is a thing called construction harassment. A company will buy a building, buy out a couple of rent stabilized tenants, renovate them, fill the entire building with lead and asbestos, force the other tenants out. Part of the reason why we're having so much trouble getting something like the Lead Paint Right to Know Act passed is if they had to test before they did construction, then they'd have to abate and they wouldn't have these tools.
Like, why wasn't this dealt with decades ago? And it just doesn't make any sense.
I think that corporations have done a very good job of making regulations seem like the boogeyman. Like regulation is keeping you from living your lives, and they've put in all this money to make you believe that.
It just seems
Yeah.
like we have ceded so many of our rights in the name of capitalism. The history behind this is really discouraging in some ways because when you look at the creation of the EPA and how that represented such a huge leap forward from what we had before, the sort of progress that began to be made was amazing. And yet again and again we've seen two steps forward, one step back. The rollback of regulation to the extent that, they're now considering restarting the mining at Bunker Hill, for example. The smelter's gone, but if they start mining there again, what are they going to do with that metal? I mean, somebody's got to smelt it. It's not going to smelt itself. The primary smelters in this country, the things that melted rock, those are mainly gone. There's only a couple of those left. But we still have secondary smelters, which are the battery recyclers. And those are in communities, those are in cities, populated places, and their workers are exposed to lead, to other substances. Communities are being exposed. So that's dirty too. And we still haven't even finished cleaning up from the original era of smelters.
Right.
So, as you say, there is lead everywhere. People are still finding in schools, in ball fields, in public places where there used to be a smelter and everybody forgot about it. And lo and behold, there's a lot of lead there.
And I think lead is one of those things that it shuts people down because it's such a Pandora's box. They feel like you just open it and it's this massive thing that people feel like, oh, I can't possibly deal with that. And the truth is that we've done really hard things in this country before, and we can do it again. It's another reason why we're so open with our stories. I experienced the power of good government. They saved my kid's life.
I mean, what's great about your story is that it shows what somebody who is really ferociously determined to learn about what has happened can do. I mean, you were able to and had the resources to educate yourself and to learn about what was happening and figure out what was happening so that you could do all the right things for your kids. But of course, you're probably unique in that in some ways, and a lot of kids who are exposed to lead in communities where there's not a lot of money and not a lot of resources, they're not getting that kind of attention or exposure. So your story is important because it highlights what's happening to so many other families and kids who don't have those resources.
And that's honestly why we started Lead Talks, was we wanted to give a platform, not just to have these conversations like that we're having with you, but also to give a platform to families who have been affected by lead. One of the things that I would say has really buoyed me in the last year is the community of lead is a really special one. The people who dedicate their lives to ending this.
Mhm.
They wake up every day with a disease that doesn't get a lot of funding, doesn't get a lot of attention.
Yeah.
And they work to try to prevent this and treat the kids and the families and care for them. I really just wanted to go back to the book and your research because, again, when I read it, I was just so blown away by how you were able to connect these dots. And I do want to say that there are people in the lead community, whether they care for lead affected families, advocate, or are families themselves, or sometimes hesitant when things like this, which highlight and sort of stress the violence, they are very wary of it. But I have to say that I'm a big believer that light is an antiseptic. And if we don't talk about what happened with these smelters and what happened in the past, then history is going to keep repeating itself.
Yeah.
So we got to talk about this.
The amount of research that has been done to connect lead to crime is itself a powerful political argument to be made in terms of why we have to deal with this problem. Because we're dealing with a lot of people who don't care about kids. You know, there are
No, they
a lot of
don't. Not at all.
politicians don't care. A lot of the corporate people don't care. So if you can use this aspect of it to make the argument that, you know, what we saw in the 70s and 80s, when the crime rate exceeded anything we had ever seen in this country, the rising crime didn't have anything to do with the stuff that we were talking about in the 70s, you know, the whole Clinton era, the idea that Black kids are especially dangerous. It really had nothing to do with some of the core issues, one of which may have been lead. There are so many studies that talk not just about crime, but about impulsivity. I was fascinated by, for example, the studies of young women and unwanted pregnancies in the 70s and 80s. And that's, you know, an impulse problem with the frontal cortex. I think we like to have this idea of humanity and the human being as, being in control of everything and control of all their behavior. But there's a lot of things that can affect how we develop, how we may be subject to chemicals affecting brain development, by injuries, by accidents, by violence in our society. I think with Murderland, I really wanted people to think about that issue of why we're such a violent society, why we have that history, not just the sort of sensational aspect of the serial killers, but just violence itself in our society and what may have caused that and still cause.
I grew up in the 70s and 80s, and I was always scared to death all the time. And over the past several years, I started thinking, hey, like, maybe I was just really paranoid, or it was all those horror films back then. And then when I read your book, I was like, no, I was not paranoid. There was actually like serial killers running around breaking into people's homes and killing people. There was a big rise in crime in the 60s. There's like a bell curve, and you can see it, and it goes down. If you look at when lead was put in gasoline, and it goes down.
Yeah.
You take these and you put them over each other, and they are the same. And it's not just this country, but he found that all around the world.
In every country, virtually. All the different countries had different time frames in terms of when lead was introduced and when it was removed, but they do match up in a pretty unmistakable fashion. It's hard to look at those graphs and not think there's something to that argument.
I also really appreciate you saying it's not like your kids getting lead poison, they're automatically determined to be a serial killer.
Yeah.
Not all lead kids, but a lot of the kids, they have a very low frustration level.
Yeah.
And when that is activated, it's explosive.
Yeah.
And then they have no control over what happens next. They're wonderful, beautiful, creative children, and they didn't deserve what happened to them. And we can prevent this from happening to other kids. I just want to say thank you so much. I'm so appreciative of your book and your research and connecting the dots like that. Thank you so much, Caroline,
well,
also for taking the time to talk to us.
Thanks so much. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you, and just am filled with admiration for all the work you're doing to get people to recognize what this is and what's happening and what we need to do about it.